Thanks for joining me today for our virtual lecture. Today we're going to be jumping back a little. As I mentioned in class on Thursday, we put the cart before a horse a little bit, talked about how we improve food environments without spending that time defining what the food environment actually was. But I wanted to make sure we had time to talk about those solutions and interventions in person. So this week for our Thanksgiving week remote lecture, we're going to be looking into those food environments. We'll talk about first that broad definition, what it is exactly that we mean. Touch on some issues of equity in terms of food environments. We'll talk about some of the macro and micro, or I guess micro and macro food environments, homes, schools, workplaces, communities, and then talk a little bit about the interaction of the built environment as well. So let's start with that basic question of what is a food environment. And it's a pretty broad definition. We're going to go with all aspects of our surroundings that may influence diet. These can be physical locations, the home, the school, the restaurant, the grocery stores that you frequent, and then also the specific experience of what it means to acquire food in that particular environment. When we're looking at a healthy food environment, we're looking for more than just healthy food availability, but the kind of structural support for healthy food choices in so many ways, from the logistics of getting it there to the psychological desirability of those healthy foods. Now, we all know people who have overcome their food environment, folks who've grown up in a food swamp or a food desert, managed to either develop or turn things around and end up with some very healthy eating habits. And at the same time, we know people who maybe grew up around very healthy habits, a very healthy food environment, and have ended up with less healthy eating habits as they've grown. So environment, we're going to say, is not your destiny, but it is a strong predictor of what your food, your personal food choices may look like and your food consumption habits. When we look at what impacts the food environment, how is it created? It's a really complicated question. There are many, many exposures that go with this. We've got transportation options. If you have a low-income community that's separated by 2 miles from a healthy food store, and there's no public transportation back and forth directly, and maybe it's a 45-minute bus ride with a transfer to go those 2 miles, that's one thing. But what if that healthy food store is on a major transit line coming home from a major employment center? That could mean something else entirely. But so transportation options are definitely going to play a part in this. And we've got the physical boundaries, places that are easy for us to get to, and then also the social boundaries, places that we feel welcome or places that we feel excluded. If you've taken our built environment class, you've learned a lot about land use. And we know that by putting healthier options closer to people, they're more likely to use them. It's common sense. It's pretty basic. We also know that food environment is affected by media exposures. We've got deliberate ones. We've got advertising where food companies are deliberately attempting to sway our choices, or maybe health promoting organizations are trying to sway our choices. But we also have incidental exposure. What are the people we admire in the media? What do they eat? Where do they shop? What do they do? Do they eat out all the time, or are they cooking vegetables at home? So many exposures. And then we talk about kids who don't have the filter in place to determine, whether something is entertainment or promotion. It's a really complicated environment. When we try to measure or discuss the food environment for a specific population, we try to focus on the influences that are most proximate to the places where people live and work. We actually started doing a lot of our early assessment for food environments on people's homes. And we weren't quite finding these strong relationships between food environment at home and health outcomes that we were expecting. And then we realized that we really needed to include a workplace as well, school environments for children. So when we talk about assessing food environments and the impact of food environment, we need to look at all of the food environments that we spend time in as well. So pretty complicated. Now, when we talk about trying to come up with a framework to discuss food environments, we're back to that socio-ecological model that we saw in our interventions and solutions discussion as well. Again, it's a very complicated framework to display graphically, but that's because it's a pretty good representation of what our life actually looks like, right? We've got our individual factors, our network factors, settings, physical environments, and then our macro level environmental factors as well. So when we look at this confluence of multiple influences, multiple levels of influence, it's a pretty good representation of how complicated the influences on the food environment actually are. So when we talk about food environments, which in some ways we've been talking about all semester, why is this important? Why is this something that we even want to dig into here in our food systems class? Well, first, they really do shape what food choices are feasible and that we're likely to choose. When we talk about the possible impact of a food environment, it's going to structure the choices that we have, and it's also going to help us to influence us to make the choices that we do. Just whether a food product is at eye level on a shelf or whether it's down by our ankles. Choices as simple as this can be of influence. They also, in addition to structuring our choices, they really do subconsciously alter our preferences and consumption patterns. If you think about, heading down or maybe heading down to the student union with great plans to buy yourself a healthy lunch, and then you walk past something that smells really, really good, right? Now, it didn't come out there and advertise and say to you, you should be eating this hamburger instead of the salad that you had planned for yourself, or wouldn't pizza be great today? But just being in the environment with those kinds of choices available has subconsciously altered your plans. And then we've also got all the influences on consumption patterns, our experiments that we see with serving size, serving container size, so many ways that the way the food is presented in that environment can also alter our consumption. And then the other thing that we really have to keep in mind when we talk about food environments is equity. We know that not every community in the United States has the same options when it comes to food choices. It's definitely one of the less equitable aspects of our food environment here in the United States. So we have to keep in mind when we talk about the importance of food environments, one of the things that we're really talking about here is its effect on health disparities and chronic disease rates as well. So maybe a better question would be, why aren't food systems important? It affects our public health concerns in so many ways. Here's a bit of a graphic that can help to visualize one of our major influences on food environment here in the United States, which would be fast food. So this is a map of the United States with with McDonald's McDonald's density represented as points of light. So if you look at the way that this particular food retailer has spread across the United States, you can see the influence that is going to have on the kinds of food environments that we have available. We've also got a couple of tools, one of which that you worked with this semester, that we can use to measure the food environment. As with any kind of research, if we want to start talking about its effect, we have to find some way to measure that objectively. And we've gone through a couple of iterations. We know that we have data sources that talk about the kinds of stores, and then data sources that talk about the kinds of food. And we use both of these to try to come up with measures of the food environment. So data sources about the kinds of stores. We see some great interactive web tools for this. We're going to take a look at the USDA Food Environment Atlas. And these are going to be based on the addresses and kinds of stores that are available in communities. And then we actually have the food audits like you did with the FROST tool. Just so you know, FROST isn't really the industry standard or the standard for the field on data collection in that environment. There's actually this tool called NEMS, the NEMS. Unfortunately, the training for that takes 40 hours, and I don't feel like it's fair to expect you to do that kind of training in order to use the NEMS audit tool, along with all the other responsibilities you have over the course of the semester. It's very similar kinds of questions, but it is much more in-depth, and it also can be used to assess food service retail, so fast food restaurants, full-service restaurants, that kind of thing. But that same idea of using an audit tool to assess numerically the kinds of foods that are available and how much they cost. And then we also have some more comprehensive food environment assessments, ways that communities can identify and document the food resources available that that may not be reached through either of these tools. These tend to be more of a qualitative assessment and more difficult to compare from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. As with any kind of assessment, we've got to make sure that we're collecting valid and reliable data. Um, Data quality can definitely be a problem if we went through the Frost audit tool without the training. We may have recorded information differently from investigator to investigator. And then anytime we collect data through an online source, we also want to look at this idea of ground truthing. So we've got some amazing online tools available, whether it's Google Earth or the maps that we can create through GIS. We've got some really amazing tools available, but it's always going to be important to make sure that we are reflecting accurate conditions on the ground, and that's what this concept of ground truthing means. So if we take a look at some of the data that we can get from that USDA Food Environment Atlas, this is a map that was generated from that system, and it is a county-by-county breakdown of populations with low access to food stores. So the darker the segment is, the greater population with low access to food stores, and the lighter the segment, the smaller that population. Let's take a look actually directly at that website, USDA Food Environment Atlas. If you want to use this for your own purposes, you can always find it just by Googling the site. That will bring you here to the ERS Food Environment site, and then you can enter the map. Once it pulls up the ERS map, you can take a look at the different kinds of data that can be displayed. So this is actually the number of fast food restaurants per 1,000 population percent change from 2007 to 2012. So you can see by our legend here the representation for each of those. And then you can also change the map here. Maybe look at store availability, grocery stores in 2012, and we'll pull up again county by county the number of grocery stores in each of those areas. So you can see this is a really powerful tool. This is definitely national level data that's being collected. This will be relatively easy to compare county to county. And also you can pull together some great graphics if it's ever anything that you're working on in a professional capacity, or perhaps even for your research paper for our class. Once we've got the maps together, what do we do next? So the ERS USDA maps show us a national level picture. But here's an example of what can be done with more specific data. This is a map that was put together by the city of Baltimore, and they were looking at some specific information about the food environment. So these darker gray areas, these are areas that have been identified as food deserts. We see the light gray triangles being fast food restaurants, got a good collection of those, as well as our darker gray triangles, which are carry-out restaurants. The solid lines represent neighborhood boundaries, and the darker gray, the darkest gray here is going to be where we find carry-out restaurants at a public market as well. So once the city of Baltimore identified these influences on their food environment, the next thing that they did was start finding ways to improve food access in the areas that they identified as food deserts. So they've got their data collected. They did some ground truthing, made sure they're accurately representing the situation as it was in real life, not just in electronic or virtual life. And then they used some intervention strategies to try to improve food access in those areas. You'll note they also worked with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, which is actually the organization that sponsored the writing of the textbook that we've used here in our class. If you're ever looking for some more resources after you leave our class, they do have some excellent resources available on their website. All right, we're going to wrap here for the first part of the lecture, and we'll be back to talk more about equity when we continue.